If you've ever worked in a large office, you probably know the feeling of being trapped in a rigid, bureaucratic machine. You follow the manual, appease bad bosses, and hope your daily work actually matters. In his late 30s, the man who would eventually engineer the world's largest financial network looked at his resume and declared himself a complete professional failure. His name was Dee Hock. Throughout the 1950s, Hock bounced between mid-level management jobs. He consistently generated high profits, but he routinely clashed with his supervisors. He despised the military-style corporate hierarchies of the era that prioritized blind obedience to procedure over actual, meaningful purpose. This fierce independence was forged during his childhood in the 1930s. Growing up in the severe economic scarcity of rural Utah, Hock survived by performing grueling agricultural labor for a penny a pound. He learned extreme self-reliance, not corporate conformity. Traditional managers viewed him as rebellious and unmanageable, but his inability to conform was actually the first sign of an analytical mind trapped inside a broken organizational system. Hock's friction with corporate America eventually escalated into outright exploitation. After moving to Los Angeles, he took a risky job managing a failing finance office for a local millionaire. Instead of a standard salary, he was promised a 10% cut of the profits. Hock labored exhaustively for nearly a year and generated a $500,000 profit for the owner, only for his boss to use legal loopholes to steal the entire $50,000 bonus. Desperate for work, he took another regional supervisor role, only to be fired when he uncovered internal fraud and refused his executives' explicit orders to cover it up. Broke and stranded in a city he hated, Hock fell into a severe clinical depression. At his absolute rock bottom, with 2 young children and a pregnant wife to support, he drove to a local facility for unemployment benefits, but he never made it inside. He sat perfectly still in his car for an hour and a half, physically and emotionally paralyzed. His deeply ingrained work ethic made the idea of crossing that threshold feel like a complete loss of his personal dignity. He drove home empty-handed. He agonized over his situation, constantly asking himself, "What is wrong with me?" For a long time, he genuinely believed his inability to thrive in a normal business environment was his own personal failing. Exhausted, Hock made a radical decision for self-preservation. He resolved to completely abandon his ambition. He moved his family to Washington State in 1966 and took an obscure, mid-level role at the National Bank of Commerce. He called this strategy retiring on the job, planning to use a fraction of his intellect just to collect a paycheck and hide from corporate politics. He thought he was stepping away from the fight. Instead, this exact desk job placed him directly at the epicenter of the most severe operational meltdown in modern financial history. To understand what Hock walked into, you have to look at the chaotic early days of consumer credit. In 1958, Bank of America launched the Bank America card. By the mid-1960s, trying to establish a nationwide monopoly, they aggressively franchised the brand, mass mailing millions of live credit cards directly to consumers. The result was an unmitigated disaster. Because banks were sending out active cards without background checks, organized crime and unpaid consumer debt skyrocketed. Furthermore, there was no centralized way for different banks to settle transactions. The back offices of American banks were drowning in a literal sea of physical paper drafts, hemorrhaging millions of dollars. By 1968, the situation was financially desperate. Bank of America called an emergency meeting of its licensee banks in Columbus, Ohio. The room quickly devolved into toxic finger-pointing and threats of lawsuits, with executives proposing nothing but a weak committee to catalog their complaints. Watching the exact bureaucratic incompetence that had plagued his entire career unfold on a national scale, Hock's retired intellect surged back to life. The 38-year-old manager stood up and commandeered the room. He bluntly told the executives that making a list of grievances was an exercise in corporate cowardice and that they needed to engineer an entirely new operational model for the industry. In that room, Hock realized that the global banking system was imploding for the exact same reason he had failed in his early jobs. The rigid, top-down power structures of the era simply could not process complex human and economic ecosystems. To fix the crisis, Hock proposed a concept he called a chaotic organization. He derived the term by blending the words chaos and order. He argued that human organizations, much like biological ecosystems in nature, thrive when they operate exactly at the intersection of those two forces. The first, highly improbable step was removing the monopoly. Hock confronted Bank of America leadership and convinced them to completely surrender their ownership of the credit card network to a cooperative of all participating banks. Once divested, Hock structured the order of the chaotic system. The newly formed central entity, which would later be named Visa, would act solely as a neutral central nervous system. It would handle the technological burden of transaction processing, maintain the infrastructure, and prevent network fraud. Then came the chaos. Inside that shared infrastructure, the thousands of member banks maintained total independence. They were free to fiercely compete against one another for customers, setting their own interest rates and reward programs. Because membership was open to any bank that met the security standards, this cooperative framework neatly bypassed antitrust laws. The shared clearing system became more valuable with every new institution that joined, creating an irresistible economic gravity that pulled in banks worldwide. By entirely decentralizing power, Hock weaponized his lifelong hatred of toxic bosses. He built an unbossable, self-governing global network where no single executive could impose their will on the whole. Today, the scale of Hock's ecosystem is unfathomable. Visa's global network currently processes over $14 trillion across hundreds of billions of transactions every year. Under his initial leadership, the system successfully transitioned global commerce away from manual, physical paper drafts and turned money into alphanumeric data, moving across borders at the speed of light. This chart shows the immense financial vindication of his journey. From the devastation of his stolen $50,000 profit share in Los Angeles, Hock's founding equity and executive leadership at Visa eventually vaulted his personal net worth well past $100 million. The man deemed entirely unmanageable and practically worthless by the mid-century corporate establishment had architected the single most ubiquitous financial engine in human history. Yet, in 1984, at the absolute peak of his corporate power and wealth accumulation, Hock executed a maneuver that stunned the financial world. He resigned as CEO of Visa and simply walked away. He was acutely aware of the corrupting nature of authority. He deeply feared what he called the four beasts of leadership: ego, envy, avarice, and ambition. He recognized that remaining at the apex of Visa carried the immense risk of turning him into the exact type of greedy, power-hungry boss he had spent his life fighting against. Seeking fulfillment beyond wealth, Hock retreated to a 200-acre isolated ranch on the Pacific coast in Pescadero, California. He isolated himself to work the land, explicitly trading his money and executive power for liberty, time, and a deep connection to nature. Following his sudden departure, Visa never missed a beat. It continued to scale exponentially, proving Hock's ultimate structural thesis. A truly chaotic organization doesn't require a charismatic dictator or a cult of personality to survive and thrive. Dee Hock's journey from a paralyzed, depressed middle manager to a global visionary proves that extreme friction with the status quo isn't a dead end. Our deepest professional failures and our visceral frustrations with broken systems are often the exact blueprints required to build something completely revolutionary.